Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be the Game Week 7 cheat sheet. If you've never seen the cheat sheet series before, it's effectively a tier list of players in FPL, taking into account the underlying stats, my assessment of players' minutes, manager sort of almost preferences on players, my evaluation of team strengths, and then the wider fixture run for players. So not only the three fixtures that you can see between Game Week 7 and 9 here, but beyond that, with a little bit less importance applied to that. Something I'd like to mention, as I've already said, is over the international break, we will update the numbers towards the 25-26 numbers. I still think that, just from my perspective, I still look at, the updated numbers. I've looked at all the numbers for the players, but I still think from an NPXG, sort of XAG type of perspective, last year's numbers are still probably a little bit better in terms of actually building a concrete player on certain players. Now, sometimes, of course, because of changes in roles or even lack of samples within certain players in the previous season, you almost have to just rely on this season and then even, I guess, years beyond last. On top of that, for the Seabrits, an interesting thing I'd like to mention at this point is outside of the midfielders, which I think is a little bit more erratic, the Seabrit numbers actually that I'm seeing in defense are actually still quite consistent, generally speaking, for, last season compared to this season. So that's just something I wanted to mention. But they will be updated to 25-26 numbers. I just think that 7 games of sample size is very good, and we can work off of that. And I will have more time to actually update all the physical numbers and make sure that they're right and that they're ready for the Game Week 8 cheat sheet. So do look forward to that. I am aware that people want to see that, and that will be changed. Those will also be supported by the Fantasy Football Hub numbers, right? We have all these numbers in Opta Stats. So when I say that I've looked at the numbers, I've definitely sort of taken them into account. If you remember the last What We Learned series, which we did last international break, I already covered some of the initial sort of DEFCON numbers. So the cheat sheet isn't built on last year's numbers. It's built on a mixture of everything because I try to take into account as much as I can. But as I said, the Opta Stats numbers are there. Obviously, the Fantasy Football Hub projection model has already taken into account a lot of the numbers and how they've evolved for certain players. So the modeling tool, of course, implements that. So if you want to get suggested transfers and you want that to be based on reliable information, a mix of past and present, have a look as well at the Fantasy Football Hub. You can see it in the link in the description below. So do feel free to access it to get pro tools and dominate your mini leagues. Now, let's just jump into the midfield cheat sheet. I think personally, one of the things I'd like to mention at the 5 million position is that it is probably a slightly overrated position. Sure, there are players that get defensive contributions, almost every other week in the midfield position, but that still for me isn't particularly great. When you compare it to some of the defenders who quite honestly have a higher chance of actually getting points through, their own ability to get returns, their own ability to get clean sheets, that for me actually out edges a lot of the 5 million picks in the game. So what I've done this week to reflect things is Dewsbury Hall is suspended, so he gets a drop. Stack, I still think is a touch overrated in the sense that, yes, I've always said this in the videos that I've made, but his current positioning doesn't mean that he's a DEFCON monster, right? Last year's numbers and his historical numbers are a mixture of DM and almost center back numbers that influence the high average rating. We've still seen, though, that he's been able to hit defensive contributions. I think at least 2 matches already within the Premier League. Interestingly, he didn't hit it versus Bournemouth, a team where it's quite easy to get those ratings. That just shows it's quite positional. I think if I was to even use an example, Tielemans and Paqueta, I feel like are very, very similar in the sense that these are players that can almost, on a good day, for example, hit that DEFCON contribution, and then on a poor day can actually have a pretty poor average, but their average will still be somewhat decent. Compared to, let's say, someone like Morgan Rogers, who just never gets DEFCON, and that's a big difference. So there's still some value towards someone like Stack. Now, the other players in this list, I think, are mostly here because of a mixture of set pieces and DEFCON. So Granit Xhaka, I think, is one of the top picks. We've already seen his defensive contribution numbers to be really, really solid this season. If anything, he's played really, really well. I believe some sort of, aggregator type rating websites have him almost as the best performing midfielder in the game. You don't get any points for that in FPL. But the reality is he still has some underlyings. He still has some set piece share. And that's a positive, right? So he's a very interesting pick from that perspective. Ayari's a little bit of a shift in expectations in terms of minutes, where I'm almost looking at the Brighton team now. And actually, he seems to be almost the preferred player that actually gets to stay on and play close to 80, 90 minutes a match. And so I think if you almost have access to as a Brighton player from that perspective, he's an interesting pick if you want to have a 5 million player. Now, the point that I'd like to make in terms of the wider meta picture is I still think a 4.5 million defender potentially is better than a 5 million midfielder. And that for me changes things in terms of how much value you're going to place into having a 5 billion midfielder. At the same time, it really just depends on how many forwards you're going for, right? If you go for less forwards, that also means you don't really need to shop into this position. Maybe it's even the case that, let's say, some of the budget forwards could still be better but that would only be budget forwards, I think, at that 5.5 price tier and above. Whereas obviously in the midfielder, you do have access to decent sort of points expectations. And I feel like there's not much separating between a lot of these picks here. Like Lukic and Garner, I've also added in because they have a mixture of set piece share, as you can see within some of the matches, and them actually getting assists on the weekend, but then also their potential to get defensive contributions or come close towards those defensive contribution numbers that are good enough for them to be a solid pick. I don't think that makes them overwhelmingly amazing, but they're solid. In the next tier, I've actually added Jaden Anthony. Now, he's completely demolished the Premier League so far. It's so hard to almost speak on a player that I feel like is still peaking continuously, but does play for potentially one of the worst teams in the league. And yet him individually is still sort of performing at an absolutely ridiculous level. And because his prior numbers have never been at this rate, I don't think that I have suddenly all the confidence in the world that he's going to maintain this sort of level of performance, right? So I do think I'm expecting a pullback from him, but so far, so good, right? This is a player who I think had 8 goals in the championship last season, playing around 40 plus matches, and he's at 4 goals in 6 Premier League matches. So sure, I think there's an aspect of this player can be continuously improving, but I think it's just about how good is he really? And that question I still can't quite figure out, because when I look at, for example, some of the performance so far, great, some overperformance clearly in terms of the goals anyway so far, but the underlying stats are still solid to start with. And then there's a case and a consideration of, how the market's responding to someone like Jane Anthony. And obviously they're reacting to a lot of the goals as well. But I think let's temper our expectations a little bit. I think a yellow tier is good. Like, there are still tough fixtures in and around for Leeds, especially, or not Leeds, sorry, but for Burnley. And that's going to have an impact on him. But I will say, of course, the numbers so far within the Premier League are super impressive. And, he deserves to be on the cheat sheet just because of that. As far as Caicedo, I'll give him a soft drop. I just think that Chelsea's fixtures aren't the best. And then there's also sort of, I guess, the question of, whether he's dealing with some issues when it comes to sort of his own personal fitness. Now, I feel like every Enzo Maresca press conference is João Pedro has a niggle, Caicedo has a knock, and Caicedo actually ends up being the player who plays 90 minutes every match. João Pedro actually came on as a substitute for Chelsea and actually ended up getting a double yellow card, so a red, within his UCL match. But Caicedo has actually still played and almost slammed down another 90-minute game. Now, it might be the case that he could get some of his minutes managed over this run, but he's just such an important player for Chelsea. I don't see a huge impact. I just think that, once again, you're not expecting a lot of attacking returns for Caicedo, given that he's also increased in price point. And I still think that some of the Chelsea fixtures actually are a little bit worse than we previously thought. Like, for example, Sunderland, I would say 6 game weeks now into the Premier League, look like a much better team. So when you're kind of arriving at this fixture of Game Week 9, it's not actually as good as it previously looked. As far as Anderson as well, we've almost downgraded him previously, but it seems like he's occupying some nice positions under Ange. As far as Gravenberch and Palhinha, I've added them as well. I think the only thing with Gravenberch, I think, is the defensive contribution numbers probably still aren't at that sort of, excessively good level like Caicedo and Anderson. So he's not kind of separating himself from there. But we're starting to see a little bit more in terms of him dominating on the ball, him actually getting into attacking positions. And I think that could be a soft trend for now. So I think I don't want to overreact on that, but he deserves his place on the cheat sheet. As far as Palhinha as well, I think we're starting to see really consistent minutes from him. And, once again, those Bayern numbers weren't good because it was just a poor season overall for him. But the career numbers for his defensive contributions are very solid. And I think I would be expecting more defensive contributions from him this season. So he actually becomes quite an interesting pick if you're almost looking to shop at someone at that 5.5 price point. But where I think the true value lies within the midfield is really the tier above this, right? Anyone who's above that 5.5 million tier, roughly speaking, or closer towards that sort of 6 million tier now, I think all pose tremendous value. So Minte and Reinders, I've always said recently that I'm a huge fan of them. At the end of the day, you have almost nailed on minutes for Minte and Reinders. This is a bit of a change in terms of Minte's importance in the team. And I think maybe the Chelsea substitution of Mitoma when they were sort of 10 versus 11, or 11 versus 10 rather, versus Chelsea, is a good indication of how important Minte is. And this is also a Minte who apparently wasn't even fit before the match and still played 90 minutes. So I think that a lot of his situational substitutions are due to, for example, that one off poor performance in Game Week 1, and then that sort of slight back issue in Game Week 5. But otherwise, Minte just looks an absolutely tremendous pick. And the key thing that I would mention about his underlying stats this season is that they have flown up, right? I've always said that I question Mitoma's underlying stats. So far, he hasn't really sort of delivered towards the level of last season's numbers, whereas Minte has actually done the opposite. He's up on both XAG and also NPXG. So very, very impressive player. And I think, honestly, bit of a hot take, but I think he's potentially the best value midfielder in the game, just from a price efficiency perspective. Reinders is also close to that. You're not seeing the level of production in terms of Minte whatsoever, but this is still a City player on some set pieces as well. And I think even just being a part of the City attack has some advantages, right? So when we talk about underlying stats, I think something that we tend to miss, for example, when someone is this nailed for a really, really strong team, is all the knock-on impacts of if you're taking a lot of shots, for example, and how they can be knock-on fantasy assists. If you are, for example, just playing for a good team, generally speaking, more value just from expected clean sheets, just softly sort of taking over. And then on top of that, just as you can see, of course, playing with higher quality players, I think the benefit in terms of what you can get from an assist point of view with things like, let's say, Holland, and just being able to sort of pass to that sort of player. As far as, let's say, Paqueta, I've also given him a massive rise. Now, I was actually thinking of selling Paqueta within my own team, and then Nuno became the manager of West Ham. James Ward-Prowse was almost deposed from the team, and I don't think he's going to touch the team, very much. Like, if you look back at how Nuno treated James Ward-Prowse when he was loaned towards Nottingham Forest, I think that's really indicative of how he's going to treat James Ward-Prowse going forwards, if the Everton game doesn't convince you anyways of how he rated James Ward-Prowse. The big thing from that game is Paqueta was suddenly put on almost all the set pieces. So he's almost become the Gibbs White of this team, at least the Gibbs White of that first season with Nuno. So now Juve is wonderful in set pieces, and he's taken corners previously, but I believe Paqueta was taking both sides of corners. And that's a dramatic change from the previous numbers, right? Where James Ward-Prowse was taken, Juve was taken as well. This, to me, raises the ceiling of Paqueta a lot as a pick, because you're not almost saying that the routes towards goals are, vaguely speaking, let's say penalties and defensive contributions, but also now even more sort of set piece benefits, which also I think lead to knock-on bonus impacts. And on top of that, I think generally speaking, just moving from Potter to Nuno, I think the soft impact might just be that West Ham could be a slightly better team on defensive contributions. And maybe Paqueta is someone who, with really, really good historic CBRIT numbers, is going to be someone who I think stands to benefit the most. So I've actually given Paqueta a rise. Now, obviously, don't play him versus Arsenal away. I don't think that that's not what I'm clamoring for. It's just the case that I now think Paqueta is a much better pick than I thought a week ago. And that's just a positive, right? In terms of actually creating a little bit more diversity within the game. And I think just making more picks valid at this point in time. So Paqueta definitely does get a massive rise for me. As far as some of the other interesting picks in the game, I mean, Jorginho's still getting decent minutes for Brighton, but I think that recent sort of Welbeck performance, and also just I think Jorginho's lack of performance within any sort of role still means he's just going to be a differential for now. I think he's still solid just because of the price point, but it doesn't necessarily mean that, he's more exciting than a lot of the other picks. I think a lot of the other picks have now eclipsed him as a result of, lack of minutes for him, maybe lack of penalty share, and just lack of importance, I think, within his respective team. As far as that next tier, which is that sort of 6.5 and above tier, Kudus for me is still top. Enzo for me is still top because of Palmer being out and penalties and the impact on that. And you can even look back at the Brighton game and all the chances that he got. Just wonderful, I think, when he's nailed. But Mitoma I still think is solid, because even though, yes, I think Minte is better than Mitoma, it doesn't necessarily mean that I think Mitoma is overpriced. I think, if anything, there is a genuine consideration for maybe even going double Brighton if you really want to do that. But I think, as I said, my first point to call would be to go for Minte actually over Mitoma. Sarr, though, is just a brilliant player. Now, I have to admit that I made a mistake last week. I wasn't aware of how fit he was, necessarily speaking, because after the cheat sheet, Glasner basically confirmed that he was ready to start versus Liverpool, and then he proceeded to play, I think, 85 minutes within that match. So extremely impressive, and I got the minutes wrong there, but he definitely should have been a part of the cheat sheet last week. Now, you all know how much I rate Sarr. This is somehow still within a top flight European leagues, top 10 in just flat NPXG. It just shows you how much of an insane season he was having at the start and how he's continued that in style with Liverpool. And the last season numbers were already incredible. So I think when we look at this Crystal Palace team, and I think a lot of the takeaways every season, which is, Elise's gone, how do they fix the team? The team's much worse. Eze's gone, the team's much worse. At the end of the day, players like Sarr, even Yeremy Pino towards an extent, until he gets, let's say, better minutes, I think are all very exciting, just as long as they're on the pitch. Because this Crystal Palace team, I've just produced consistent numbers, and Sarr is that exact player. So yeah, just love the pick. And I have dropped Njai. However, I do think that some of the early substitutions are starting to settle in now. It seems like Tyler Dibling's going to get bedded in with slightly more minutes. And I think that's going to probably maybe even take up a little bit more as we head towards AFCON, right? Because there's almost going to be a process of, I guess, getting Tyler Dibling ready for the Premier League and for more Premier League minutes. Obviously, he played a lot of Premier League last season anyways with Southampton, but the point is, I think he's going to get more minutes over the run here with Everton. And of course, you've just gone past a great game, which is West Ham at home. So I've given NJ a bit of a soft drop. I also think the Everton performance was a little bit flat in terms of that was a great home game. That was a great game on paper in terms of Everton being able to actually produce some really good attacking numbers. Now, sure, the managerial change in West Ham, I think, influenced, the outcome of things, but that still wasn't a great performance from Everton. If anything, I came off extremely impressed with West Ham, and I think you'll see a lot of West Ham knock-on impacts, as you've already seen with Paqueta. But yeah, Doku for me is still at the same sort of level, because I feel like the main things for Doku is that he doesn't have some of the intangibles that some of the other players have, even though he's having an exquisite season, and I think he's clearly breaking out once again as a player. The big thing is he doesn't have things like set pieces, doesn't have things like penalties, doesn't always have guaranteed long-term minutes like someone like Matoma, for example. With, let's say, maybe a Grealish, I've also given him a soft drop. This is almost like an Everton wide drop, as you can see. Dewsbury Hall obviously being suspended hurts. I think Grealish, as I've mentioned multiple times in the cheat sheet, is obviously a very creative player, but I think also people are overestimating how impactful he is and how much of a points producer he is from an FPL perspective. So to me, I'm still not that intrigued by Grealish as a pick. Rodgers, similar situation there. And Xavi Simons, I think the issue for me is still just going to be minutes with him. I'm sort of made the point that I think I still prefer Kudus ultimately compared to Xavi over, let's say, a long-term run within FPL, because I think his minutes within the Premier League are much more secure. And at the end of the day, he's always going to hit that upper bound of 88 to 90 minutes, whereas Xavi seems to be always a perpetual early substitution. So for me, that takes away a lot of the ceiling from Xavi, and that's why I think he gets a drop coming out of a really good and unfortunately wasted opportunity with the Wolves at home game. In the next tier, we've actually had a lot of new additions. So I think people rightly pointed out last week that Gordon made a lot of sense to join the cheat sheet. I was just never going to put Gordon on the cheat sheet with a Newcastle game. Now, similarly, I've done the exact same thing with Eze, because I was never going to put him in a Newcastle away fixture. But Eze actually had plenty of opportunities to get shots. And Gordon, on the other hand, just has a really good run of games right now, where I think the minutes are still very much guaranteed for someone like Gordon. So because I still think he has some pen share, it's going to be interesting to see whether let's say, Walter Matt is going to get penalties over Gordon. But I think Gordon has taken a few penalties for Newcastle already, right? And he's taken some pretty big penalties. Like, I think even going back to, let's say, an Arsenal game, somewhere within, I guess, the vague recollection that I have of his penalties. But that is going to be a big question where I think maybe the importance of Isak and I guess his own record within Newcastle kind of allowed him to be on penalties. But if Gordon, for example, stays on penalties, I think he's one of the best picks in the game. And he's always had some really, really consistent underlying stats, as has any sort of Newcastle attacker. So for me, Gordon is about to start a great run of games coming off the suspension, and I think he's an interesting pick. With Eze, I think the question mark is going to be, is he completely nailed, or as uber nailed as people think? And also, I think by losing so many set pieces that he has, especially if Rice is going to play more Premier League football, have people almost overestimated how good I think that upper bound ceiling of Eze is. Now, I think I've even heard mentions that people think that Eze might be the best value pick in the midfield. I don't think that that's the case. I think if I even look at, let's say, some of the market projections, they're actually very, very positive, though. So this is a great launch pad to almost jump into Eze. And it seems like I think he is almost set for a pretty consistent run of starts within this Arsenal team. But they do really have a lot of depth. And I think that showed with, let's say, even Zubimendi coming off the game. The flexibility now that you have in terms of being able to play maybe Odegaard as well, who's now back fit. And what that means if they might not be, for example, in a game state where they need to chase. So, for example, we saw Eze, Odegaard, and Rice within that match, because I think Arsenal were in a position where they needed to score, and maybe they could have played with a little bit more of an offensive setup. But I think maybe going forwards, like, you're not guaranteed to see that Eze is going to play in multiple different positions. Like, he can be an early sub still, I think, and I think he can also come off the bench in certain matches. So I think I don't see necessarily Eze being a pure 90 minutes player right now. But it's nice and positive to see that he can drop 90 minutes in a game like Newcastle away. Such an important game, which I think is a testament to how important he is as a player right now. So I'm going to have him at yellow. If I got the minutes wrong, so be it. But I think it's also just wanting to balance between both situations, and also just reflecting that, once again, he's not on a lot of set pieces, especially if Rice is on the pitch, right? So that kind of takes away from that sort of ceiling. He doesn't have any pen share. So let's not, for example, I guess, over dramatize how much better Eze is just because he's joined Arsenal. As far as, let's say, the next tier, I've actually soft dropped Mbomo, and then I've given Cunha a rise. I think that kind of almost is a level set in terms of, sure, United have good fixtures, but United can also drop genuine gigantic stinkers like they did versus Brentford, and that's just a reflection of that, where still, I think the general run of games outside of Liverpool away in Game Week 8 is very, very good. But it's kind of like we almost need to taper their expectations because the team is still performing like absolute, you know what, versus, or rather, under Amarim. As far as Foden, I still think he's wonderful and a fantastic pick. I don't think I'd really touch his positioning right now. Sure, Turkey's back in training, but until I really see Foden's minutes take a bite, or even as soon as we see him coming out of the Brentford away game, which I think is a really, really good game on paper. Unfortunately, it wasn't for Man United, but I think Man City is a different beast. Let's see, right? And we can reassess on Foden after this week, where I expect more players to come back into the team coming out of the international break. Over the next two tiers, I think the biggest question mark that a lot of people have is, if you're going to nerf Mbeumo and Cunha on the cheat sheet, why wouldn't you do that with Bruno? Is he potentially even off penalties? Now, I still think he's on penalties until, we are almost given evidence to see towards the contrary. Other sort of potential penalty takers have missed penalties or not even taken penalties in sort of key crucial situations. I think Bruno will want to keep them. He has a tremendous record that I think he can fall back upon, unlike someone like Ollie Watkins. And at the end of the day, he still produces a lot of interesting numbers in terms of, a mixture of average DEFCON numbers. And then also sometimes, when he can sort of move in towards advanced positions or even within defensive positions, I mean, how much XAG he produces. So for me, I still think Bruno is a very, very top pick. I'm sure other people can disagree, and that's fine. This isn't your cheat sheet. In the next tier, though, I've given Saka a rise. I think he's potentially the most interesting midfield pick to move into. And for a lot of people, for example, who are struggling to, let's say, move Gakpo out or move Wirtz out, for example, like you have an option right here in terms of just simply going towards Saka this week. I think it makes a lot of sense. All you have to really do is just monitor his minutes versus Olympiacos if he even starts, and then Palmer's still in a void for now, and then Salah. I'm slightly tempted to maybe even drop him towards an orange. I think this might actually be the season where we're starting to see less Salah minutes, and I think that Galatasaray non-start is indicative of that, right? But the macro picture with Liverpool, as we've said already this season so far, is we've watched them for many, many games now, and they just haven't been particularly impressive. I think they got up a lot of chances versus Crystal Palace, and that was really positive in terms of a lot of the open play numbers that we were lacking for Liverpool. But still, that's creeping into poor performances in the Champions League. Their one good performance this season, I would say, just definitively speaking, was versus Atletico Madrid, where I think that was very impressive. But honestly, outside of that, there's a lot of questions, I think, over this Liverpool team. And even, I think, in the long-term minutes of Salah. I mean, I would be interested to see whether we ever see that sort of Premier League substitution. So for now, I don't want to sort of overreact, but it hasn't looked particularly great so far for Salah. In the forward position, just shifting over gears towards that, I think we finally have some movement within certain positions. I still think Foster is interesting because you just have a nailed player who you can support the bench boost, for the cheapest price possible. Krupi Jr., until he gets, starts, we don't really need to discuss him, but he's still the most interesting 4.5 auto sub in the game. And then you've got options at 4.3 and 4.4, which I'm not going to create a categorical list of them, but, they are there for you. In the 5.5 to 6 million tier, I've given Thiago a rise. Now, Keith Andrews, I have to shout out this man because I feel like for 2 games, just went for a bewildering sort of back 5 structure that clearly hasn't quite worked out. And I almost think that Brentford are just going to move back into this front 3 and back 4. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think in that structure specifically, Thiago's just going to get really, really good minutes and really safe minutes. I dropped him on the cheat sheet last week because I think if Keith Andrews was to persist with that sort of back 3, that Thiago's minutes were definitely in danger because we've already seen them be endangered, right? 72 minutes, 62 minutes versus Chelsea and then Fulham. And in this situation, obviously, I think the goals and the context within the United game helped, right? There was no Fabio Carvalho substitution. Dango starting anyways, and Thiago had a brace. So, what reason was there to even take him off? I think, looking at Thiago now, especially if Brentford are going to continue with this front 3, he just is one of the best picks in the game, just from a value perspective. And I still think he's on penalties, so that's a huge plus. Calvert-Lewin, I think, falls into a very similar camp where it seems like right now his minutes look absolutely perfect for Leeds. It is Calvert-Lewin. It is the worst finisher in Big 5 European leagues. That is all true. But he gets a lot of XG, and eventually he'll still score some goals with really high XG, as you can see within some previous matches with Leeds. And that's pretty much it with Calvert-Lewin, right? I wouldn't say he's uber interesting, but I think the penalties aspect is there, whereas Isidore, for example, who's also been added to the cheat sheet, isn't there with the same numbers. And so far, I think from a team strength perspective, it almost seems like the Leeds numbers have actually looked quite positive compared to, let's say, Sunderland, who I think have been overperforming a little bit in terms of attack, but clearly look like a very resolute defense, as we've mentioned time and time again. So I think that sort of difference of penalties might separate even Calvert-Lewin's almost like negative finishing. And yeah, that's pretty much how I would sort of look at these 2 players for now. In the next tier, I would say no changes in terms of Strand Larson and Richarlison. I think with Richarlison, he's almost benefiting from everyone else being injured. Kolumwani has the longest lasting dead leg known to man, and Solanke has probably suffered from the most, I guess, rest requiring knock that we've heard from Thomas Frank, right? Just given the lack of information we've had from all these injuries. Richarlison is still fantastic, but you are almost now looking at the Tottenham fixture game. I think the run of games actually within the next 3-4 matches is actually really solid. Unfortunately, some of the good matches are away, but his numbers are really strong. His minutes still look really good outside of, let's say, when he goes towards an international break and duty. But I think it's still positive from Richarlison for now. So because the minutes are good, I'm not going to drop him because he's suddenly blanked versus Wolves. He's still very interesting. But I think the kind of main thing holding him back from being a green is that it still feels like almost at times he can still be subbed, right? Even with Kolumwani and Solanke not being around, or even coming on from the bench, right? And then there's going to be sort of long-term knock-on impacts to owning Richarlison. As far as Strand Larson, it seems like the minutes are there, but then I think why the question mark with this Wolves team is, are they actually that good when you still have some value that's actually a lot cheaper and potentially even as good as, you know, what Strand Larson can bring. Now, the positive, of course, is he has games like Burnley at home, but as we even talked about with Sunderland, that now seems like a little bit of a worse game. So the fixture run doesn't seem perfect, and I think there's no reason to almost shop for someone like Strand Larson when you can actually just go towards a slightly more expensive tier, and I feel like get more guarantees. In the 7 million tier, Evan Nilsson's still top for me. Sure, he hasn't actually scored many goals recently, but we know the underlying are there. I think we still are, generally speaking, quite confident in this Bournemouth team. I don't see a huge reason in thinking that Evan Nilsson's a much worse pick within the game. So for me, Evan Nilsson's still very interesting. Sure, he doesn't have penalties, but I'm, still taking into account that. I've looked into, for example, some of the market numbers, and I don't think his season-long projections actually dropped much at all after Semenyo took that penalty. If anything, I think Bournemouth still seems to be a very well-rated team, and Evan Nilsson's minutes, I think, are crucially, what support a lot of his goal projections. So I think he's still a very, very top pick. And the Bournemouth run doesn't really get poor until 10-11. As far as Waltemad, I think the numbers haven't been amazing because Newcastle have clearly been a little bit more, I think, defensively tilted this season, as they always have been. But as we've said, also, Waltemad isn't someone who, like Isak, could, I guess, almost create chances on his own. But he's looked impressive, and he's still, at the end of the day, scored 2 goals so far from very few starts. So I think the biggest thing is I almost still prefer Gordon towards him, but I can see the value towards Waltemad. And there's still that open question of whether he takes penalties because he actually has a really good penalty taking record. With Sesko, we had him as a differential. I'm not going to boost him any further than that, but he's of somewhat interest. In the next tier, though, we still have, I think, the tremendous value, right? Continuing with that Evan Nilsson piece, João Pedro and Mateta are there. João Pedro just got a red card within the Champions League, as I said, and that's going to, guarantee good minutes for Game Week 8 and Game Week 9. I think the international duty piece will probably also impact, what his minutes look like in terms of Game Week 9. But actually, the pro in terms of Game Week 9 is that the game preceding that is a Champions League match, if I remember correctly. So that actually just means that he's going to be rested regardless, and that's a plus. As far as, let's say, Mateta, I've given him a rise because I think this Crystal Palace team has just been so impressive, right? He's still getting really, really good XG. The team looks super impressive still, despite all the changes, and his minutes also still look really, really good. The biggest question for me is going to be what Mateta's minutes look like with European football. So I'm recording this video right now after all the Tuesday evening games have finished within the Champions League, and I think maybe I might have, overstepped in terms of my assessment of Mateta's minutes if he suddenly plays almost like 90 minutes within European football. If it seems like he's actually getting his minutes managed there, then I think the Premier League minutes look really, really good because Crystal Palace are also really embarking on a fantastic Premier League campaign, right? So I can't see why Mateta's minutes would be almost risked too much within European football compared to, let's say, what they can do within the Premier League. With Bowen, I think the rise just comes to the managerial change. A lot of people are going to just be angling for Bowen as a transfer in Game Week 8, and I think the price drops really support almost his price point. So let's just see going forwards how Bowen evolves. I will also like to track, for example, how the markets have reacted to season-long goal projections or even assist projections of players like Bowen and Paqueta because of changes like the new manager, but then also some things that we've already tangibly seen, like the change in position of Bowen, and then also with Paqueta as well, with the sort of additional set piece. As far as the other tiers, I don't think I really want to make too many changes. Maybe I'm a little bit wrong on or harsh on Isak because Ekitike also suffered from an injury within this Liverpool match where they lost to Galatasaray. So he should be called upon to play much more minutes of football, and that's a negative. But I think just once again, given his sort of fitness context, it's still not particularly good for Isak almost as an option. I think you can almost consider Isak as a buy, for example, from a Game Week 8 perspective, where you have a little bit of an understanding of how long and how extensive this injury is, and you're coming off of a game that's a lot better, right? So not Chelsea away, even though, sure, Chelsea are getting a red card per game. I don't think suddenly that game suddenly means that Liverpool are going to absolutely squash Chelsea, because let's be honest, Liverpool have not been that impressive themselves. As far as Holland, let's just move on towards defenders. As far as, let's say, the defenders, I don't think I really wanted to touch too much on the defenders. I feel like we have a pretty accurate picture on the defenders. And I think one of the almost travesties with the defensive contribution piece of it all is that the way you're building your team now is you're almost building a block of DEFCON merchants, and you're kind of just rotating them around good fixtures anyways, but you're happy to play them regardless, right? Like, for example, if in the worst case scenario, you're suddenly playing Senesi versus Man City away, I don't even think that looks as bad as it did, in a previous season, where we used to be rotating fullbacks around good expected clean sheets and hoping for the best, right? Hoping for you to get those clean sheets when you need them, and hoping for you to get attacking returns when you need them as well. Now, because of DEFCON, I think, once again, the fixture difficulty and rotation piece has almost been removed from the game from the defensive position. And you're targeting DEFCON first, and then looking at optimizing around fixtures, because I think that's secondary to that sort of quality of return from defensive contributions. As a result, that just means that we're not tweaking the list that heavily. If anything, as you can see, the 4 million players have all stayed within the same position. I said that I preferred Alderete towards Mukiele, and it feels nice to see Alderete score a goal. Not that I actually get the points of Alderete, but just saying. As far as the other tiers, I mean, Estev still is outranking his peer Ekdal within defensive contribution, so that's a positive with Rodon as well. That's the same thing with Leeds. Mukiele still has really good numbers, so I haven't felt like the need to adjust anything. Goodmanson, I think the biggest thing with Leeds is that how often are you to still get those sort of max bonus games? It's probably a little bit lesser of a chance compared to Rodon actually getting defensive contributions consistently. At the 4.5 tier, Van de Ven actually gets a drop. I think part of this is actually just simply because even though he's actually been a massive set piece threat so far, the biggest thing for me is he's still not getting enough defensive contribution. So, we talked about how Thomas Frank can maybe change the defensive contributions a little bit for the team, but his numbers compared to some of the other top defenders within the game still is falling short. So I would say, given he's gotten so many price rises, I do think there's almost like a price efficiency piece here to talk about, where I don't think he's that interesting compared to some of the other picks. I have also introduced 3 new defenders to the game. So that is Van Heck, Tillman, and Juve. I think they're all interesting options, especially with the new managerial appointment with West Ham. Tillman is just, your pure DEFCON pick. And these players are now 4.4, right? Even with Van Heck as well. Brighton are actually about to embark on a slightly better run of games when it comes to expected clean sheets compared to, let's say, the attacking returns, even though I think the offensive players like even Minte are just at a really good price point where you don't really care so much about how good exactly the fixtures are, because they're almost underpriced for the quality of the attack that they are. And I think the same even goes arguably for defense, just given that Van Heck has gotten that price drop to 4.4. With Kilman and Juve, I think it's a similar case where now under Nuno, I think you're expecting a little bit better in terms of improvements for expected clean sheets. Still a bit of a question mark, I guess, in terms of set pieces. I think that can hopefully get fixed. I also think that almost the rate at which they're conceding set pieces is also a little bit alarming, but I think that can be solved, very, very quickly as well. So I'm not too concerned about that as a macro picture for West Ham, even though the set piece numbers are, almost record setting at this point in time, right? This many games into the season. So with Kilman and Juve, they're obviously different players. It's quite similar towards Diakite Choufe, where I think because Kilman is not like some sort of DEFCON god, you don't have that sort of separation between Senesi and, for example, Choufe, or even Senesi and even his peer in Diakite. I think this is a close comparison, ironically, even though Juve seems to be one of the most creative goal threats within the game, as you can see with the sort of level of assists he's producing. And we talked about that in the preseason as well, where I actually thought Diouf was actually a better pick than Wan-Bissaka. But it just so turned out that West Ham actually looked absolutely awful versus Graham Potter. And so there was maybe not much value owning a defender whatsoever within the game. But yeah, Diouf is just very exciting. One of the most exciting players to watch. And I think finally, of course, at that sort of price point and, with slightly better clean sheet expectations, it's going to be an interesting pick for sure for the time to come. Other than that, I think not many significant changes. I will mention that I don't have Cash on this list, but I think I will hold Cash at a similar tier towards Konsa. He probably has slightly better attacking returns, but we've also seen Konsa produce his own attacking returns as well. And he is also very, very nailed. So, not much of a separation there, because I think that team, unfortunately, doesn't produce many defensive contributions. And you probably don't care about Aston Villa whatsoever. So, why keep them on the cheat sheet if you're not going to have them post game week 7? So, just to mention. In the 5 million tier, I've actually given Burn a rise. I think Newcastle have just been so impressive on defense. Probably I've actually reacted a little bit harshly towards them in the past, but I mentioned that I think Burn was my preferred pick with the Newcastle just purely because of the DEFCON piece. So I've actually given Burn a rise. With Livramento, he was stretched off versus Arsenal, but I don't exactly know like how long he's actually out for. It seems like it could be diagnosed as a meniscus tear, or rather like an MCL. So let's see what happens. The injury time frame could be somewhere between 1 week to many weeks, even months. So let's just see what happens there. But I don't think it looked promising, just given the injury, his reaction, and him having to be stretchered off. However, we have seen, I think, players be stretchered off and actually come back to football in a few weeks' time. So Livramento might not be on the cheat sheet for now, but I think Burn is just exceptional as a pick as a Newcastle asset. With Tottenham, I think one of the issues once again is that the defense contribution numbers aren't exceptional, but Romero is better than Van de Ven at that. So I think I haven't given Romero a drop, but keep in mind that there is an asterisk around Romero because he was not involved within the Champions League squad against Bodo Glimt. I do think that Romero actually not being a part of the team actually does reduce the quality of the defense a little bit too. So something significant to mention. Other than that, it's unfortunate that we're getting so many injuries on the defensive positions. With Chalobah, he's suspended for Gameweek 7. Nothing else to really add in terms of that. In the next tier, I've given Guardiola a drop because unfortunately we've just lost the Burnley at home game. He was also subbed off at 17 minutes. I don't think that's going to happen too often because obviously Guardiola's going to continue starting matches, but he's probably got the potential to be subbed off for someone like Ake in the future as a like for like. But I wouldn't be too worried about his minutes. I think still you're just looking for clean sheets and then also the occasional attack and return because he's not at that sort of left back Guardiola attacking demon type of level, or even positionally speaking, put in a position to do that. Other than that, I think I've given Konate a fair rise. We're still seeing reduced minutes from Konate, so that still means I think that tapers off from the DEFCON ceiling, even though he's actually outperformed Virgil in recent games. I almost think sometimes the irony with DEFCON so far is that sometimes some of the players who are making so many mistakes, really poor tackles, for example, like an unsuccessful tackle actually leads to, for example, defense contributions. So I guess the irony in some of the performances that we've seen where some players have gotten some really one-off great defensive contribution matches is that the worse that they play, the worse actions that they get involved with, the better the DEFCON ceiling is for that specific potential match. But as we said, as a bit of a long-term trend, Virgil still is much better than Konate in defensive contributions and even in being a set-piece threat. So even though all the numbers have actually looked very favorably for Konate so far, I still think I wouldn't hold him as being better than Virgil, but he is much cheaper. Other than that, not too many changes because we gave Timber a rise last week. I think that's deserved because I think the DEFCON numbers look pretty good. He just looks so imperious, and I think he's going to get a lot more of those Premier League starts. Whereas Calafiori, I think, is a bit mixed with MLS in terms of like the quality of game, the type of game. I think you could see how MLS could play a very significant role within, let's say, the match in Newcastle as a substitute versus, let's say, how White wasn't going to be utilized within that match and maybe instead is going to play for Olympiacos, right? As far as the sort of top tier players, I gave Virgil a drop last week. I feel like I'm comfortable with that just because I wanted to separate how good Gabriel is. And that's pretty much it. I think with the defense this season, we've talked about how you can very well create, let's say, a very sort of 4.5 bound defense and maybe actually have one or two of these sort of more expensive upper bound picks. And I feel like that very much still is a template. And, I, for example, myself own Lacroix and Virgil and Gabriel as my own team. I think that is one way to go about it. You don't have to do that because the 4.5s are still really, really good. Even the 4s are still really, really good. So just something to mention. In the goalkeepers, I've added Pope and Henderson. Fair play to all the people calling me out for not putting Pope. Yep. I am cognizant that Newcastle are very good defense. And this is a reflection of that. Same with Henderson and Crystal Palace. So I think they both deserve to be there at the sort of price points that they're at. Martinez and Sanchez get drops because I just think the Chelsea injuries are just going to impact the Chelsea defense. I think with Martinez, the issue is just, don't really rate the Aston Villa defense right now. And then last but not least, I've given Pickford a drop and Alisson a drop as well. But that's because of the Alisson potential injury as he was subbed off in that match for Galatasaray. And actually, that just makes Marmardashvili an interesting pick. And I put him at yellow for now without really knowing exactly the extent of the Alisson injury. But of course, he can be a bit of a game breaker because access towards Liverpool defense at 4.3 is just silly. Once again, though, keep in mind last season, we actually had a similar situation where Kelleher actually was available for a few weeks. And what actually ended up happening was that Kelleher was mass bought and then suddenly was mass sold very, very quickly. So the people who actually bought into Kelleher actually ended up maybe even holding some price drops because of how quickly the ownership changed and how that sort of had a transfer impact. So one of the things with goalkeepers is, it feels nice on paper to make a goalkeeper transfer into someone who's really cheap and getting access towards a cheap defense. But I guess the length of the Alisson injury will determine exactly how good Marmardashvili is as a transfer because there's a knock-on impact of, what what happens when you actually need to force a future goalkeeper transfer out, which a lot of people don't account for when they're actually looking for moves. Now, if you're wildcarding into a goalkeeper, I guess you might even have with free transfers banked that sort of flexibility and that luxury of being able to do that, but just something to keep in mind. But that's going to be it for the Game Week 7 cheat sheet. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you guys soon. Take care and goodbye.